do a quick synopsis of Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War. I'm going to start off, it's the spring of 1865. Lee knew that the South was not going to win. So on April 8th, he sent a message to Grant. The two met at the Appomattox Courthouse, and they kind of set up the surrender terms. Now Grant was very nice. He let the Southern soldiers keep their guns, he let them keep their horses, and he even fed them because he was of the mindset that we need to let the healing begin, so you get to keep your stuff, because he knew they were going to need it anyways if they were going to help rebuild the South. All right, now the Civil War started 4 years earlier, before all this happened, when the South seceded. That happened in February of 1861. Because they believed in states' rights and they believed they had the right to have slaves, whereas the Northerners felt that that was immoral, and they just thought that they shouldn't be able to have slaves. Anyway, on April 14th of 1861, the South attacked Fort Sumter, and this was going to spark the beginning of the Civil War. Now, at the beginning, they thought the war wasn't going to last very long. This will be a really short-lived war. But they soon found out that it wasn't, and the war dragged on for 4 long years, until finally the North won the war. All right, now after the Civil War was over, Lincoln's goal was to get the Southern states back into the Union as soon as possible, and he had this 10% plan where 10% of the population had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union. Now, Congress, on the other hand, did not like this idea at all. They thought the South had to be punished, and they came up with their own plan, which was a 50% plan. Now, Lincoln didn't like this plan, and he refused to sign it into law, so Lincoln and Congress were just not getting along. Okay. Also, before this happened, Lincoln had his big Emancipation Proclamation speech. So as the Union armies were freeing these areas in the South, lots of slaves were running around. They were running away from their owners, and because they were free now. And so they kept sending messages up, what are we going to do to help these slaves? In March of 1865, even before the war was over, the North started putting into place this system called the Freedmen Bureau, which was a government organization to help the new freed slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau helped with housing, hospitals, learning how to read and write. They opened up schools, all in an effort to help the situation of the new freedmen, since they didn't know how to read and write if at all. And of course they had no money, so they needed the help badly. On April 14th of 1865, unfortunately for Lincoln, he went to Ford's Theater, had bad security, and a man named John Wilkes Booth assassinated him, which left the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, in charge of now taking care of this whole Reconstruction project. Now, Johnson was originally a Southerner from Tennessee. Okay? He was the only one of the South that thought that secession was wrong. Okay? And he refused to give up his seat in Congress, even though all the seats around him, all the Southern seats, I mean, everybody was gone because they made their own little country down there. Okay? Johnson believed that white Southerners had been tricked by the wealthy white Southerners into fighting this war that's going to end up ruining the South. Okay? Now, Johnson's support for the Union made him a hero in the North while he was running for vice president. Okay? After Tennessee was occupied by the Union Army in 1863, Lincoln appointed him the governor of Tennessee. In 1864, Lincoln asked him to be vice president, which he agreed to. But he never thought he was going to have to be the real president. He just figured that would be an easy post for him. Okay? But he was only vice president for 8 months because soon after Lincoln was shot. Okay. Now, lots of Northerners were pleased with President Johnson. He was a Republican, okay, and he had attacked Southern slave owners in lots of his speeches, and he called them traitors to the Union that must be punished, okay. But on the other hand, he still did not feel that blacks should have equal rights with whites, okay. He believed that white men alone must manage the South. So it's kind of opposite of what the Northerners believed. It wasn't long before the Northerners started getting a little bit upset, and I'd say maybe a little bit more than a little bit upset, with Johnson, because he did believe that the whites should rule the South. Okay? He wanted to stick with Lincoln's 10% Reconstruction plan, and not only that, but he pardoned all the Confederates and former Confederates in the South. Okay? And then he called for elections in the South, but then he also said that only white people should be allowed to vote. Okay? Now, of course, the new Southern state governments were elected. Now, Johnson only made a few requirements for these states to come back into the Union. Okay? The most important of these was they had to declare secession illegal, and they had to pass the 13th Amendment, which was to abolish slavery forever. Okay? Now, Johnson's plan, of course, pleased Southerners who wanted to rejoin the Union. They didn't want to have to all swear allegiance. 10% is good enough. But the Republicans, also known as the radical Republicans in Congress, were getting more and more worried. Okay? Now, after the elections, these Confederates in the South, they began passing these laws that were called black codes. And really, the purpose of the black codes was to try to return the freedmen back into slavery. Now, the black codes are going to strip the freedmen of their civil rights. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to hold office. Okay? If they wanted to travel, they needed permission from their white employer. Okay? And if they wanted to do anything besides being a farmer, they had to have permission from a white judge. And of course, a white judge is not going to give the freedmen permission to do anything, and anything that might let them have some more power. Now, when Congress reconvened in 1865, they were none too happy. They heard all these horrible stories about things that were going on in the South because of the situation down there and the black codes and returning the freedmen back into slaves. And then on top of that, all these new elected representatives from the South were coming to Congress. Now, the Northerners, congressmen refused to let them sit down. But President Johnson said, nope, they need to sit down, which made the Northerners even more mad. So what Congress ended up doing was giving the Freedmen's Bureau some even more powers to help the freedmen. And in February of 1866, the Congress wrote a bill and sent it to be approved by President Johnson, and this was called the Freedmen's Bill. And the Freedmen's Bill was to give more police powers to the Freedmen's Bureau. But Johnson vetoed the bill. Not only that, but Johnson stated that the federal government in Washington, D.C. should not order citizens around. Okay? And he also said that each state had the constitutional right to determine the laws within its own borders. Now the North thought, wait a minute, this guy's just going over to the enemy, because that was the whole purpose of the war, right? They shouldn't have the right to have slaves because they're making up their own laws. So then in March, Congress passed a second bill called the Civil Rights Bill. And wouldn't you know it, once again, Johnson is going to veto that bill, okay? But this time, there were enough votes in Congress, and they're going to overturn his veto. And of course, Johnson's going to be really mad about this, and he just said that Congress is filled with a bunch of traitors. Now, the Northern Congress is still really mad at Johnson, and he's kind of lost all his credibility with them. And the radical Republicans in Congress sought an opportunity here and says, okay, now we can really do what we want to do. So that what they wanted to do was make a new plan of Reconstruction for the South, and they wanted a chance to create a society where all men were truly created equal, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Thaddeus Stevens, he was the leader of the Radical Republicans, and he summarized the ideas of the Republican Party by saying, every man, no matter what his race or color, has an equal right to justice, honesty, and fair play with every other man, and the law shall secure those rights. Such is the law of God, and such ought to be the law of man. So what he's stating is he wants them all to have civil rights. So what Congress does is they went ahead and they, to guarantee the freedmen's rights, they passed an amendment, the 14th Amendment, on June of 1868. And the amendment gave all citizens, including blacks, protection of their civil rights. Okay? It was then sent to the states to be approved, and the amendment widened the gulf between Johnson and Congress because he didn't want them to have equal rights. Okay? And if he publicly attacked them. Okay? Then some ugly incidents happened of violence in the South. In July, blacks demonstrated in New Orleans, Louisiana to they were protesting for their rights, and a mob of white policemen and firemen brutally attacked them. Now, you would think policemen and firemen are there to protect people, but this was not the case there. Okay? So because of what was going on, when the election came of November of 1866, northern voters overwhelmingly chose a vast majority of Republicans over Democrats to be in Congress. Okay, so here now the Republicans are going to launch a new program of Reconstruction, and Thaddeus Stevens stated that the whole fabric of Southern society must be changed because he knew there had to be some kind of a change. So they passed the first Reconstruction Act. And what this did was it kind of disbanded all the states in the South, and it divided the South up into 5 really big regions. One of them was Virginia by itself. One was North Carolina and South Carolina. That was another region. Alabama, Georgia, and Florida was another region. Texas and Louisiana was another region. And Arkansas and Mississippi was the last region. So all of these regions are going to be ruled by a governor, a military governor, and their role is going to be to protect the new freedmen and give them the rights that they deserve. Okay? So, of course, the freedmen are going to be proud. It says proud and defiant. The freedmen came out to vote for the first time now because they didn't have to worry about the other codes. An observer recorded that blacks voted their entire walking strength. No one stayed at home. No one could come to at home. Who could come to the polls? Now, of course, the Southern men did not like this, and they called it wicked and those kinds of things. But so be it. Okay. At this point, things were getting much better for the freedmen. They were building schools for them to attend to. 16 African Americans were elected to Congress. They were really getting involved with politics. So things were doing good. Whites were coming down to the South to volunteer to help them out. And thousands of northern, lots of businessmen were coming down from the north because they wanted to start up business in the South because they saw an opportunity. Now, the Southerners resented these guys coming down to the South. They were called carpetbaggers and scallywags. And they were called carpetbaggers because sometimes they'd put all their possessions in a big bag and they would roll them up and put it on the train and come down south. Okay? And the Southerners didn't like them because they just thought that the Northerners were taking advantage of them, but really it's just, I think, probably just good business. Now, slowly but surely, the Southern states started coming back into the Union. Okay? After they ratified the 14th Amendment, they accepted the 14th Amendment. Okay? Now, in Congress, one of the radical Republicans, his name was Charles Sumner, his idea was what we should do is take all these big plantations, break them up, and divvy up the land between the freedmen. Unfortunately, that didn't work, and all that land was returned back to the former plantation owners. Okay? Which left the freedmen in a tough situation, so they had to become what are called sharecroppers. Now, a sharecropper means that since they have no money, they're going to take proceeds from their crop and they're going to share their crop with the owner. He's going to make profit, where the poor sharecropper is just going to barely be able to survive. And what often happened was that the sharecropper did not make enough money off their land, so they had to borrow more money from the owner of the plantation, and then they were stuck being there because then they needed permission to leave and those kinds of things because they owed money to the plantation owner. Not only this, now comes this new American kind of terrorist group called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan did not like the radical Republicans, the Northerners in the South, and this was a terror organization to try and scare them off and have them retreat back to the North. Okay? So what they wore these hoods on their heads, and their goal was to terrorize people. Okay? They would attack the new freedmen, they would attack anybody that would support the freedmen, and it was often sometimes difficult to travel at night because you had to worry about these Ku Klux Klan members. Okay, we're going to find out in November of 1866, they're going to elect Grant, that's General Grant, President of the United States. Now, people were complaining because it seems that even though we wanted to give all these rights to the freedmen in the South, in the North the situation was a little bit different, and the African Americans were not allowed to vote still in the North. So they just said that the radical Republicans, they just wanted the votes of the freedmen in the South just to keep them in power. So what Congress decided to do was pass the 15th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment, which we should all know, guaranteed the right to vote for all men in the United States. Now, it didn't say women. Women aren't going to get the right to vote till around 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Okay? But after the 15th Amendment was accepted, Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas finally joined the Union. All right, so by now about 10 years has gone by, Reconstruction's been going on, and people in the North are starting to get tired of helping people in the South, right? They believe that the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment were enough to protect the civil rights of the freedmen. Okay? So, and they just didn't want to spend any more money on it. Okay? So as support for the Southern, for this Reconstruction program was going on, gradually more and more states in the South are going to revert back to white control. Okay? And by the election of 1876, only 3 Southern states still had Republican governments. Okay? Now, here we come to our next election. And our next election is going to be the Republican nominee was a Civil War hero. His name was Rutherford B. Hayes, and he was running for president. And the Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden. Now, both men were known to be honest, and they supposedly had a good strength of character. And when all the votes were counted, there was only a difference of 250,000 votes between Hayes and Tilden. Now, Tilden received 250,000 more votes. Okay? But votes do not win an election. the United States runs on, and it runs on still today, what's called the Electoral College, which means you may have the popular vote, but you may not win the election still. Okay? And this is the situation we find ourselves in at this stage of the game as well. Okay? So the candidates with the most electoral votes is the one who wins. Now in 1876, Tilden didn't have enough electoral votes, even though he had more popular votes. In fact, Hayes had won the electoral election by votes from 3 southern states that were still under Republican control. Okay? So now we've got a problem. Okay? The nation's going to be thrown into this crisis. So finally, in March of 1877, as we learned in other history lessons, here comes another compromise, and this is going to be called the Compromise of 1877. Now the deal was the Democrats were going to let Hayes become president of the United States, but in exchange, he had to remove the northern troops from the South. Okay? Now this is going to mark the end of Reconstruction, because once the troops leave the South, there's no one there to protect the freedmen, and the situation is going to go downhill for the poor freedmen from this point.